The world went still just before sunrise. First came the thundering hoofbeats, like distant war drums pounding through the morning mist. Then the war chants rose, clear and piercing, cutting through the pale dawn light. Rebecca stood rigid on her weathered porch steps, rifle clutched in trembling hands she barely knew how to aim, her nightgown whipping against her legs in the biting wind. The Comanche warriors materialized like apparitions through the rolling fog, 75 strong, their faces adorned with stark lines of scarlet and obsidian. Leading them was a towering figure, draped in mountain lion pelts, his penetrating gaze fixed directly on her. He raised his arm skyward. The warriors halted in perfect unison. Time seemed suspended at that moment. And then she saw him, perched behind the leader on a magnificent copper-colored stallion with intricate white spirals painted across its flanks, was the boy she thought she had rescued. But now, as their eyes locked across the misty divide, she wondered, had she saved him, or had she merely been a pawn in something far beyond her understanding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of sage and iron across the plains, whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen. It swept across Rebecca Bennett's small homestead, finding its way through the gaps in the rough-hewn logs, into the floorboards worn smooth by years of careful steps, and even between the yellowing pages of her grandfather's old journal, where she documented each passing day with meticulous care. Rebecca lived in a modest cabin at the edge of Willow Creek, a settlement barely worthy of being called a town. It consisted of a general store with warped wooden shelves, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall, and a one-room schoolhouse that stood empty more often than not. Her home sat a good mile from the nearest neighbor, precisely how she preferred it. The cabin itself wasn't much to speak of. A steep roof that leaked during heavy rains, a stone chimney that smoked when the wind blew from the north, and a porch that listed slightly to one side despite her repeated attempts to level it. The isolation wasn't by chance. 4 years had passed since Rebecca had been welcome in Willow Creek. 4 years since the townsfolk had decided she carried misfortune like others carried coin purses, something always close at hand and ready to spill out at the worst moments. Which some of the older women would whisper when she passed by on her monthly trips for supplies. Cursed, others would say, making the sign of the cross when they thought she wasn't looking. None of it was true, of course. Rebecca was simply a woman who had suffered more than most and had the visible reminders to prove it. The right side of her face bore a latticework of scars from hairline to jaw, souvenirs from the night her family's barn had caught fire. The flames had claimed not only her smooth skin and auburn hair, but also her husband Samuel and their infant, our daughter. While the town had come together to help douse the flames, their charity had cooled as quickly as the ashes when Rebecca didn't have the decency to die alongside her family. A widow who survived when her husband didn't was already cause for suspicion in these parts. A widow with a scarred face who rarely spoke and knew which herbs could ease pain or bring down fevers. That was enough to build walls of fear and superstition that no amount of kindness could scale. So Rebecca adapted. She spoke less each year until her voice grew rough from disuse. She stopped trying to make the women of Willow Creek accept her offerings of freshly baked bread or medicinal tinctures. Instead, she focused on her small plot of land, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil, tending to the 3 chickens and single milk cow that provided her with eggs and butter, and hunting small game when necessary. On Sundays, she would still attend the small church service, sitting alone in the back pew while families filled the front rows. She would bow her head during prayers, mouthing the words silently, and leave before the final hymn to avoid the awkward silence that followed any attempt at conversation. Pastor Miller would acknowledge her with a nod, but never directly addressed her during his sermons. It was as though speaking her name might summon something best left undisturbed. The children were the worst. They would dart behind their mother's skirts when Rebecca passed, peeking out with wide eyes as if expecting her to transform into something monstrous. Some of the bolder boys would occasionally throw pebbles at her cabin windows or leave dead snakes on her porch. Little cruelties that she endured without complaint. She hadn't always been this solitary creature. Once, Rebecca had been the schoolteacher, beloved for her patience and gentle humor. She had organized town socials and led the choir with a voice clear as a mountain stream. Samuel had been the town's blacksmith, respected for his honest work and fair prices. They had built their life, together beam by beam, dream by dream, until that autumn night when everything changed. The fire had been swift and merciless. Samuel had gone back into the burning barn to save their daughter, sleeping in her basket, while Rebecca helped with the evening milking. Neither had emerged. Rebecca had tried to follow, but strong arms had held her back as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and timber. She had fought against those restraining hands, screaming until her throat was raw, the heat of the flames searing her face even from a distance. She sometimes still woke in the dark, the phantom sound of crackling wood and her husband's final shout echoing in her ears. Afterward, the town had watched her carefully, waiting for her to break completely. When she didn't, when she instead rebuilt her life with quiet determination, their concern had slowly transformed into something darker. Perhaps she hadn't truly loved Samuel if she could continue without him. Perhaps she had somehow caused the fire herself. Perhaps the scars were a punishment for sins they couldn't name, but surely existed. Rebecca never bothered to correct these whispers. The truth was simpler and more painful. She continued because she had no choice. Grief was a luxury that required the community to shoulder some of the weight, and she had none. This particular morning began like any other. She rose before dawn, washed her face in the basin of water she'd drawn the night before, and pinned her hair back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. She no longer bothered with mirrors. The shocked expressions of strangers told her everything she needed to know about her appearance. She dressed in a faded blue cotton dress, the sleeves patched at the elbows and the hem redone twice to account for wear. Function over beauty had become her unspoken motto, though she still kept one silk ribbon, a deep burgundy that had been Samuel's last gift to her, tucked safely in a drawer for occasions that never seemed to materialize. After feeding the chickens and milking the cow, she set about her garden, pulling persistent weeds from between rows of carrots and potatoes. The summer had been unusually dry, forcing her to carry water from the creek daily to keep her vegetables alive. Her back ached from the effort, but the garden was her lifeline through the winter months when game grew scarce and trips to town became impossible due to snow. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yellowing grass, Rebecca paused in her work. Something felt different about this day, though she couldn't quite place what it was. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end despite the heat. She straightened, one hand pressed against the small of her back, and surveyed the horizon. Nothing but the endless expanse of prairie grass and scattered copses of cottonwood trees met her gaze. In the distance, the dark line of the river wound, its way across the landscape like a great serpent. Beyond that lay the territories where few settlers dared to venture, Comanche hunting grounds that had already claimed the lives of several homesteaders brave or foolish enough to ignore the invisible boundaries. Rebecca had never feared the Comanche the way others did. She respected their claim to the land and stayed well within the unspoken borders that separated their worlds. In the 4 years since losing Samuel, she had encountered them only twice, both times at a distance as hunting parties passed by. her property without incident. They had no reason to trouble a lone woman who posed no threat, and she had no reason to fear those who had never harmed her. It was just past midday when she heard the sound, a low, ragged moan coming from behind her tool shed. Her first thought was that a coyote had been injured, perhaps caught in one of the traps set by Willow Creek's fur traders, despite her requests that they keep their snares off her land. She set down her gardening tools and moved cautiously toward the sound, pausing to retrieve the hunting knife she kept sheathed at her belt. If it was indeed a trapped animal, she would need to either free it or end its suffering quickly. What she found instead stopped her breath cold in her chest. Huddled against the back wall of the shed, partially hidden by a tangle of wild rose bushes, was a boy. No more than 10 or 11 years old, he was dressed in buckskin leggings and nothing else, his copper skin slick with sweat despite the cool shade. His right shoulder bore an intricate tattoo, a series of black lines forming a pattern she didn't recognize but instantly understood the significance of. Comanche. The boy's eyes flew open as her shadow fell across him, dark, fever-bright, and filled with equal parts fear and defiance. His left leg was crudely bandaged with a strip of cloth now soaked through with blood, and beside him lay a primitive bow, unstrung and useless in his current state. Rebecca stood motionless, knife still in hand, as the boy tried to push himself further into the thorn bushes, a hiss of pain escaping through clenched teeth when his injured leg scraped against the ground. Their eyes locked in mutual assessment, predator and prey, though she wasn't entirely certain which of them was which in this moment. Her first rational thought was that she should walk away. A Comanche child on her property could only mean trouble. If the townsfolk discovered she was harboring him, they would have the excuse they'd been waiting for to drive her out completely, or worse. If his people came looking for him, they might assume she had captured or harmed him. Her second thought, following so closely it nearly eclipsed the first, was that he was a child in pain, and that trumped all other considerations. Slowly, Rebecca sheathed her knife, keeping her hands visible as she knelt a few feet away from the boy. His eyes tracked every movement, his small body tense as a drawn bowstring despite his obvious weakness. Up close, she could see that the wound on his leg was deep, a clean slash that looked like it had come from a blade rather than an animal's claws or teeth. She pointed to the injury, then to herself, pantomiming, bandaging, and cleaning. The boy's expression remained wary, but he made no move to flee, likely because he couldn't. His skin burned with fever, and the wound would need proper cleaning and stitching if he was to have any chance of avoiding blood poisoning. Without speaking, words would be useless between them anyway, Rebecca rose and walked unhurriedly back to her cabin. She returned moments later with clean cloths, a jar of honey, needle and thread, and a small bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. The boy watched her approach, his breathing shallow and rapid. When she knelt beside him again, he made a small gesture with his hand, not pushing her away, but rather pointing to something in the bushes beyond her vision. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder and spotted a small leather pouch wedged between the rose thorns. She retrieved it carefully and handed it to the boy, who clutched it to his chest with evident relief. Trust established, however tenuously, she set about examining his wound. The cut was deep but clean, slicing through muscle, but missing the major vessels that would have caused him to bleed out quickly. Infection was beginning to set in, evidenced by the angry red streaks extending up from the edges of the wound. Rebecca tore strips from the clean cloth and used one to wipe away the worst of the dried blood, working with steady, gentle movements. The boy remained silent, though his jaw clenched when she touched the most inflamed areas. She showed him the whiskey bottle before pouring some over the wound, unsurprised when he didn't cry out, despite what must have been excruciating pain. Comanche boys were trained from early childhood to endure suffering without complaint. After cleaning the wound thoroughly, she spread honey over it, a trick her grandmother had taught her to fight infection, and prepared to stitch it closed. The boy watched with interest as she threaded the needle, seemingly unafraid of the procedure. When she made the first stitch, his only reaction was a slight intake of breath, his dark eyes never leaving her face. As she worked, Rebecca found herself talking to him, her voice rusty from disuse. It didn't matter that he couldn't understand. Her words, the soft, steady cadence, seemed to soothe him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" she murmured, tying off another neat stitch. "Wonder what you were doing out here all alone. Hunting party wouldn't leave one of their own behind, especially not a child." The boy's eyelids grew heavier as she continued her work, the combination of fever, exhaustion, and relief gradually overcoming his wariness. By the time she tied off the final stitch, he was drifting in and out of consciousness, his small hand still clutching the leather pouch. Rebecca sat back on her heels, considering her next move. She couldn't leave him out here exposed to the elements, especially with night approaching. The logical choice, the only choice really, was to bring him into her home, where she could monitor his fever and keep the wound clean. With a sigh that acknowledged the potential consequences of her decision, she gathered the boy carefully. In her arms, he was lighter than she expected, all sinew and bone beneath sun-darkened skin. His head lolled against her shoulder as she carried him to the cabin, his breath warm against her neck. Inside, she laid him on her own narrow bed, covering him with a light quilt despite the summer heat. She needed to break his fever, and that meant keeping him warm enough to sweat out whatever poison had entered his system through the wound. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Rebecca maintained her vigil, periodically wiping the boy's forehead, with cool cloths and coaxing sips of water between his cracked lips. She mixed a tea of willow bark to help with both the fever and pain, sweetening it with precious honey to make it palatable. The boy drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally muttering words in his native tongue that she couldn't understand but recognized as either prayers or delirious rambling. Night fell, bringing with it a chorus of cicadas and the distant howl of coyotes. Rebecca lit a single candle, keeping the light minimal in case anyone from town happened to pass by. Not that they would. Her nearest neighbor was old Mr. Garretson, and he rarely ventured out after dark. But caution had become second nature to her. She settled into the rocking chair beside the bed, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. The boy's fever seemed to be breaking, his breathing more regular now, though still too rapid for true comfort. In sleep, with the lines of pain and fear smoothed from his face, he looked impossibly young and vulnerable. Rebecca found herself wondering about his family. Were they searching for him? Did they think him dead already? How had a child so young ended up alone and wounded so far from his people? The last question troubled her the most. The slash on his leg had been made by a blade, not an animal's claws or a fall onto rocks. Someone had done this to him deliberately. The thought kindled a slow-burning anger in her chest, surprising in its intensity after years of feeling little beyond a dull resignation. She must have dozed off sometime in the early morning hours, because she woke with a start to find pale dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window. The boy was awake, watching her with dark, solemn eyes that seemed older than his years. His fever had broken during the night, leaving his skin cool and dry to the touch when she laid a cautious hand on his forehead. "You're looking better," she said, unsure if her voice startled him after so many hours of silence. He didn't respond verbally, but his gaze followed her as she moved around the small cabin, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of her molasses. When she brought a bowl to him, he sat up without assistance, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. Rebecca demonstrated eating a spoonful from her own bowl, then handed him the second portion. He hesitated only briefly before accepting it, his hunger evidently overcoming any lingering suspicion. As he ate, she checked his wound, pleased to find the angry redness already receding from the edges. "You heal quick," she observed, "quicker than most." The boy finished his meal in silence, then pointed to a cup of water on the small table beside the bed. Rebecca handed it to him, struck by the everyday normalcy of the gesture, despite the strangeness of their situation. He drank deeply, then surprised her by offering a single word: "Takwaho." Rebecca tilted her head, uncertain if this was a greeting, a name, or something else entirely. The boy touched his chest. "Takwaho," he repeated, then pointed at her with a questioning expression. Understanding dawned. "Rebecca," she said, touching her own chest. "My name is Rebecca." "Rebecca," he echoed carefully, the syllables sounding strange in his mouth but recognizable. This simple exchange marked the beginning of something neither could have anticipated, a fragile bridge spanning two worlds that had only known each other through violence and fear. As the morning light strengthened, turning the cabin's interior from grey to gold, Rebecca found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. Outside, unseen by either of them, a hawk circled above the cabin before winging its way westward toward the distant territories where the Comanche ruled. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of approaching rain and the distant thunder of hoofbeats, still days away, but drawing inexorably closer with each passing hour. The second day, Takwaho was strong enough to sit up without assistance. Rebecca fashioned a crude crutch from a forked branch and leather strips, allowing him to move around the cabin while keeping weight off his injured leg. The boy adapted quickly, his natural agility compensating for the awkward support. He watched her complete her daily chores with keen interest, his dark eyes missing nothing as she milked the cow, churned butter, and tended her small garden. Communication remained limited, but was improving. He had a quick mind for languages, picking up simple English words and phrases with surprising speed. She learned that he was 12 summers old, older than she had initially guessed, his slight frame making him appear younger. In turn, she taught him the English words for objects around the cabin, forming a patchwork vocabulary that bridged their worlds. Rebecca knew she couldn't keep the boy hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone from town would come by, most likely Levi Jackson, the trader who occasionally brought supplies in exchange for her herbal remedies. Or worse, Takwaho's people would come searching for him. Each passing hour increased the risk of discovery, yet she couldn't bring herself to send him away, not while his wound was still healing, and certainly not without knowing what had happened to him. That evening, as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew, Rebecca attempted to ask the question that had been troubling her since finding him. "Who hurt you?" she asked, pointing to his leg. Takwaho's expression darkened. He set down his wooden spoon and made a gesture Rebecca had come to recognize as his way of asking for something to draw with. She handed him a piece of charcoal and watched as he sketched on a scrap of paper 3 figures on horseback, their hats and clothing distinctly those of white men. "Soldiers?" she asked. He shook his head, then added crude rifles to the drawing. "Hunters," she guessed. "Or trappers." Takwaho nodded, then added another figure, smaller, clearly meant to be himself, running from the men. With quick, angry strokes, he showed one of the men slashing at the boy with what appeared to be a long knife. "They attacked you. Just one boy." Rebecca couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. Takwaho added more small figures to the drawing. Children. He spoke several sentences in his own language, clearly frustrated by his inability to make her understand. Finally, he pointed eastward, toward Willow Creek, then held up 7 fingers. 7 days ago, near town. Rebecca pieced together. The boy nodded gravely. Rebecca felt sick. She knew there had been a hunting party that left Willow Creek about A week ago, led by the Brenner brothers, three mean-spirited men who boasted loudly about their prowess with both women and weapons, usually while drunk at the saloon. They'd returned just 2 days ago, though she'd only heard about it secondhand from the miller's wife when she'd gone to town for flour. "Did you fight back?" she asked, miming, drawing a bow. Takwaho's eyes flashed. He added to his drawing, showing himself striking one of the men with a rock before fleeing. Then he spoke a single word, repeated 3 times with increasing emphasis, "Numunu." Rebecca had heard that word before. It was what the Comanche called themselves. It meant the people. Takwaho wasn't just telling her that he had defended himself. He was declaring his identity with pride. "The men who hurt you are bad men," she said slowly, making sure he understood. "Not all white people are like them." Takwaho studied her face, his expression unreadable. Then he pointed to her scarred cheek and made a questioning gesture. Rebecca touched her scars, the familiar ridged texture beneath her fingertips, a permanent reminder of all she had lost. For a moment, she considered lying or simply refusing to answer. She had never voluntarily discussed her scars with anyone, but something in the boy's direct gaze demanded honesty. "Fire," she said, miming flames with her fingers. "My husband, my baby." She trailed off, making a gesture that she hoped conveyed their absence. Takwaho nodded solemnly, seeming to understand more than her limited explanation conveyed. He placed his small hand over his heart, then extended it toward her, a gesture so simple yet so profound in its empathy that Rebecca had to look away to hide the sudden moisture in her eyes. They finished their meal in silence, the shared understanding between them deepening beyond what words could express. That night, Rebecca gave Takwaho her bed again, despite his protests, settling herself in the rocking chair with an extra quilt. Just before she blew out the candle, the boy spoke softly from beneath the covers. "Ah," he said. At her questioning look, he added, "Thank." Rebecca smiled. "You're welcome. Good night, Takwaho." "Good night, Rebecca," he replied carefully, the English word sounding strange but earnest on his tongue. The third morning dawned, clear and cool, with dew sparkling on the tall grass surrounding the cabin. Rebecca woke early, as was her habit, to find Takwaho already up and attempting to help by stoking the fire. His movements were becoming more fluid, his injured leg clearly healing well under her care. After a breakfast of cornbread and the last of her precious coffee, Rebecca decided it was time to change Takwaho's bandages again. The boy sat patiently on a stool as she unwrapped the cloth from around his leg, revealing the line of neat stitches underneath. The wound was healing remarkably well, the edges coming together cleanly with minimal scarring likely. "You'll have a story to tell your grandchildren someday," she remarked, applying a fresh coating of honey before rewrapping the leg with clean bandages. Takwaho watched her work, then suddenly stiffened, his head turning toward the window. Rebecca froze, straining to hear what had alarmed him. Then she caught it, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. "Hide!" she whispered urgently, pointing to the small root cellar accessible through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. Takwaho grabbed his crutch and moved with surprising speed, disappearing into the dark space below. Rebecca closed the trapdoor and quickly threw a rag rug over it, then straightened her hair and apron, trying to appear as normal as possible, despite her racing heart. The rider approached slowly, the creaking of leather and jingling of tack growing louder as they neared the cabin. Rebecca stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun. The silhouette that greeted her was unfamiliar, not one of the townsfolk she recognized, not the trader she occasionally dealt with. The stranger rode a dappled grey mare with an easy confidence, his broad shoulders straight beneath a weather-beaten duster. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but as he drew closer, she could make out a strong jawline darkened by several days' worth of stubble and eyes the color of pale winter sky. He reined his horse to a stop, a respectful distance from her porch, removing his hat in a courteous gesture that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that marked him as from somewhere further south. "Name's Nathaniel Harding. Hope I'm not disturbing you." Rebecca clutched her apron, acutely aware of the boy hidden beneath her floorboards. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Harding? We don't get many strangers through these parts." The man dismounted smoothly, though Rebecca noticed he favored his right leg slightly as he landed. "I'm looking for work, ma'am. Heard in town they might need an extra hand at the mill, but Mr. Miller said they were full up." He gestured vaguely back toward Willow Creek. "Lady at the general store mentioned you might have some fence that needed mending." Rebecca frowned. Mrs. Peterson at the general store had never done her any favors before, and the sudden referral seemed suspicious. Did she now? That's mighty thoughtful of her, considering we barely speak. Nathaniel's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Well, truth be told, ma'am, she didn't exactly offer your name up freely. I overheard her telling the sheriff that the witch woman out past Crooked Creek had a fence about to fall over in the next strong wind." He shrugged apologetically. "Figured anyone the town gossips call a witch might be someone worth meeting." Despite her wariness, Rebecca felt a reluctant smile tug at her lips. There was something disarmingly honest about the man's admission. "My fence is just fine, Mr. Harding," she replied, which wasn't entirely true. The north section had been leaning precariously for months, but I appreciate your forthrightness. He nodded, replacing his hat. "Can't abide liars or those who talk behind folks' backs. Seems to me this town has more than its share of both." He glanced around her property with an appraising eye. "That roof could use some work before winter, though shingles on the south corner are curling something fierce." Before Rebecca could respond, a sudden cry came from within the cabin. Takwaho had either hurt himself or been startled by something. The sound was brief but unmistakable. Nathaniel's head turned sharply toward the door. "You got company, ma'am?" Rebecca's mind raced. "Just my nephew," she improvised quickly. "He's visiting from back east. Took ill on the journey. Nothing serious, just a fever." The stranger's pale eyes studied her face, lingering briefly on her scars, before returning to meet her gaze directly. Most people couldn't manage that. They either stared openly at her disfigurement or pointedly avoided looking at her face altogether. "Must be nice having a family visit," he said neutrally, though something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe her explanation. "Boy, do you need anything? I've got some willow bark in my saddlebag, good for bringing down fevers." "We're well supplied, thank you," Rebecca replied stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should check on him." Nathaniel nodded, but made no move to remount his horse. Instead, he glanced toward her well. "Mind if I water my horse before heading back? Been a long ride." Rebecca hesitated, torn between wanting the stranger gone immediately and not wanting to appear unduly suspicious. "Help yourself," she finally said. "Pumps around back by the barn." With a tip of his hat, Nathaniel led his mare toward the well. As soon as he was out of sight, Rebecca hurried inside and lifted the trapdoor. Takwaho crouched in the darkness below, a makeshift weapon, one of her kitchen knives, clutched in his hand. "It's all right," she whispered, "but stay hidden until he leaves." The boy's eyes were wide with fear or anger, she couldn't tell which. He whispered something in Comanche, his voice urgent. "I don't understand," Rebecca said helplessly. Takwaho pointed toward the door, then made a gesture like a gun firing. "He's dangerous," she guessed, her blood running cold. The boy shook his head in frustration, then touched his leg where the wound was still healing, followed by making the shooting gesture again. Understanding dawned. "He's one of the men who hurt you?" "Takwaho." shook his head again, more emphatically, and made a different gesture, pointing to his eyes, then to the door. He saw? He witnessed it? Rebecca struggled to interpret. The boy nodded vigorously, then held up his hands, wrists together, as if bound. He was a prisoner of the men who attacked you. Takwaho nodded again, relief evident on his face that she finally understood. Rebecca's mind whirled with this new information. If the stranger had witnessed the attack on Takwaho while himself a prisoner of the Brenner brothers or their companions, that might explain his interest in her property. Perhaps he wasn't looking for work at all, but for the boy. "Stay here," she whispered, closing the trapdoor again. "Don't make a sound." She straightened just as a knock came at the door. Nathaniel stood on her porch, hat in hand again. "Wanted. To thank you for the water, ma'am," he said. "Horse is mighty grateful." Rebecca remained in the doorway, blocking his view into the cabin. "You're welcome. Safe travels back to town." Instead of leaving, Nathaniel shifted his weight, his expression turning serious. "Miss Bennett, that is your name, correct? Rebecca Bennett?" She nodded warily. "There's something I should tell you," he continued. "Something that might concern that nephew of yours." Rebecca's hand tightened on the doorframe. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Harding." "I'm not implying anything, ma'am. I'm trying to warn you." He lowered his voice. "The Brenner brothers are back in town, bragging about how they taught some Indian brats a lesson last week. One got away, according to their story. They've been drinking heavily and talking about searching the outlying properties." Cold fear washed over Rebecca. "Why are you telling me this?" Nathaniel held her gaze steadily. "Because I've seen what those men are capable of. I was their guest for several days before I managed to part ways with them. They're not the type to leave loose ends, especially ones that might tell tales." "And why should I trust you?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't," he replied frankly. "Not yet, but I owe a debt that can't be repaid to people who look a lot like your nephew, and I don't take kindly to men who hunt children for sport." Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town reached them. Nathaniel turned sharply, his hand moving instinctively to his side, where Rebecca now noticed the outline of a revolver beneath his. "Duster, expecting more visitors?" he asked grimly. Rebecca shook her head, panic rising in her throat. "No." Nathaniel stepped off the porch, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "Get the boy somewhere safer than your root cellar. I'll buy you some time." "Why would you help us?" Rebecca asked, desperate to understand this stranger's motives before placing her trust in him. The man's weather-lined face softened slightly. "Because 20 years ago, a Comanche woman found me half dead after deserting the army, and instead of taking my scalp, she fed me and taught me how to survive." He nodded toward the approaching riders. "Now go. I'll handle this." Rebecca didn't wait to hear more. She rushed inside, lifted the trapdoor, and helped Takwaho out. "We need to hide you somewhere better," she explained hurriedly, leading him toward the back of the cabin, where a small window opened onto the kitchen garden. Outside, she could hear Nathaniel greeting the newcomers with casual confidence. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Beautiful day for a ride, isn't it?" A gruff voice responded, one Rebecca recognized as belonging to the eldest Brenner brother, Wade. "Who the hell are you? And what are you doing at the witch's place?" "Name's Harding. Just watering my horse before heading back to town." "The lady was kind enough to oblige." Rebecca eased the window open and helped Takwaho through it, his injured leg making the process awkward and painfully slow. Outside, the conversation continued. "You seen anything unusual around here?" Wade Brenner asked. "Any strangers or Injuns?" "Can't say that I have," Nathaniel replied easily. "Just the lady and her property." "Why? You boys hunting something?" "Besides deer," a different voice answered. The middle brother, Curtis, whose nasal tone grated on Rebecca's ears even from a distance. None of your damn business what we're hunting. You best move along, stranger. Rebecca led Takwaho toward the small tool shed behind the garden, helping him hobble as quickly as his injury allowed. The voices grew louder as the men apparently dismounted. "Miss Bennett home," Wade called out. "We got some questions for her." "She mentioned heading down to the creek to wash some linens," Nathaniel answered smoothly. "Might be a while before she's back." "That's so." The skepticism in Wade's voice was clear. "Then I reckon we'll just wait inside for her, make ourselves comfortable." "I wouldn't advise that," Nathaniel said, his tone hardening. "Lady values her privacy, as do most decent folks." Rebecca helped Takwaho into the shed, moving tools aside to make space for him behind a stack of burlap sacks. "Stay here," she whispered. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I come for you." The boy grabbed her arm, his dark eyes intense with worry. He pointed to her, then to the cabin, and shook his head vehemently. "I have to go back," she insisted. "If I'm not there when they look inside, they'll know something's wrong." From the front of the property came the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "You're standing in our way, mister," Wade's voice carried clearly. "That's not a healthy place to be." Rebecca squeezed Takwaho's shoulder. "Trust me, and trust him, the stranger. I think he's a friend." The boy's expression remained troubled, but he nodded once, sliding deeper into the shadows of the shed. Rebecca closed the door quietly and hurried back toward the cabin, circling wide to approach from the creekside, as if she had indeed been washing clothes. As she rounded the corner of the cabin, she found a tableau frozen in hostile stillness. 3 men on horseback, the Brenner brothers and their cousin Roy Dawson, facing off against Nathaniel, who stood casually with one hand resting near his holstered revolver. "Well, look who's back from the creek without a single wet garment," Wade sneered, spotting her. "Your new friend's a poor liar, Miss Bennett." Rebecca lifted her chin. "He's not my friend, Mr. Brenner, just a traveler passing through." She turned to Nathaniel. "I thought you'd be gone by now, Mr. Harding." Nathaniel shrugged. "Was just explaining to these gentlemen that trespassing isn't neighborly." Curtis Brenner spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed deliberately close to Rebecca's feet. "Speaking of neighborly, we're looking for a runaway, young Indian buck, probably wounded. Thought you might have seen him being out here all alone with nothing but time to watch the road." Rebecca met his gaze evenly, years of practice helping her maintain a calm facade despite her racing heart. "I haven't seen anyone pass by except Mr. Harding here. Perhaps your runaway went north toward Jenkins' place." Wade studied her with narrowed eyes. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough." "I mind very much," Rebecca replied. "This is my property, and you're not welcome on it." The oldest Brenner laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "That's not very Christian of you, Miss Bennett. What are you hiding?" "Only my distaste for uninvited guests," she replied coolly. "Now please leave, all of you." She included Nathaniel in her glance, not wanting to single him out. Roy Dawson, a wiry man with a face pockmarked from childhood illness, nudged his horse forward. "We ain't asking permission, woman. That Injun brat is worth $20 to the army for questioning. He attacked Wade with a rock, damn near took his eye out." "Sounds like he had his reasons," Nathaniel remarked. Wade's hand moved to his pistol. "You calling me a liar, stranger?" "Wouldn't dream of it," Nathaniel replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just noting that children rarely attack grown men unless they're frightened for their lives." The tension in the air thickened. Rebecca stood perfectly still, acutely aware that any wrong move could trigger violence. These men were known for their tempers even when sober, and she could smell the whiskey on them from where she stood. "I want all of you off my land," she said with as much authority as she could muster. "I have no Indian boy here, and I won't have bloodshed on my property," Curtis laughed. "What you gonna do about it, witch? Cast a spell?" Nathaniel stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Rebecca and the mounted men. The lady asked you to leave. I suggest you do so while you still have the option. Wade Brenner's face darkened with anger. 3 against 1, stranger. Those ain't odds I'd bet on. I've faced worse, Nathaniel replied calmly. For a long moment no one moved. The only sounds were the snorting of horses and the distant call of a meadowlark from the creek. Then, unexpectedly, Wade smiled, a nasty expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll go," he said, "for now. But we'll be back with the sheriff. And if we find out you've been harboring an Indian, Miss Bennett—" He let the threat hang unfinished in the air. With a jerk of his head to the others, he wheeled his horse around. The 3 men rode off in a cloud of dust, but not before Curtis turned in his saddle to call back, "Sweet dreams, witch. Better check under your bed tonight." Rebecca watched them go, her legs suddenly weak with relief. Beside her, Nathaniel remained tense, his eyes tracking the riders until they disappeared over the rise. "They'll be back," he said quietly, "and next time they won't leave so easily." Rebecca turned to face him, studying the stranger who had inexplicably placed himself at risk for her and Takwaho. "Why did you stay? You could have ridden away." Nathaniel's pale eyes met hers. "Some debts can never be fully repaid, Miss Bennett, and some men deserve to be stood up to." He glanced toward the shed where, unbeknownst to him, Takwaho was hidden. "Your nephew safe?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded once. For now, Nathaniel agreed grimly. But now isn't going to last much longer. Dusk painted the prairie in shades of amber and violet as Rebecca, Nathaniel, and Takwaho gathered around the small kitchen table. The boy ate ravenously, a good sign that his strength was returning, while the adults spoke in low voices, planning their next move. "The Brenner brothers won't wait long," Nathaniel said, absently running a thumb along a deep scar that crossed his left knuckles. "They'll either come back tonight with reinforcements or tomorrow with the sheriff." "Sheriff Davis is Wade Brenner's brother-in-law," Rebecca added grimly. "He won't question their story." Takwaho glanced between them, understanding enough of their conversation to follow along. He set down his spoon and spoke several sentences in Comanche, gesturing eastward. When he finished, he looked expectantly at Nathaniel. The older man shook his head. "I only know a few words of your language, boy. Not enough to follow all that." Takwaho frowned in frustration, then turned to Rebecca. "People," he said in halting English, holding up 7 fingers, then spreading his hands wide. "Many people. Your tribe," Rebecca guessed. "They're looking for you." The boy nodded emphatically. Nathaniel leaned forward. "How far?" Takwaho held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the setting sun. 3 days' ride west, Nathaniel translated. "That would put them near Buffalo Creek, maybe the Twin Buttes area." Rebecca's heart sank. "We can't reach them in time. Not before the Brenners return." "We could try," Nathaniel suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "I've got a good horse. The boy could ride double with me." Rebecca shook her head. "His leg can't take that kind of journey yet. The stitches would tear open within the first few miles." Silence fell as the implications of their situation settled over them. The cabin suddenly felt very small and isolated, a fragile shelter against the gathering storm. Takwaho broke the silence by sliding off his chair and retrieving the small leather pouch he kept with him constantly. From it, he withdrew a polished stone pendant suspended on a braided leather cord. The pendant was obsidian, shaped like a crescent moon, with intricate carvings along its edge. He held it up so the fading light caught its glossy surface. "Father," he said firmly, then pointed to his own chest. "Son of chief." Rebecca and Nathaniel exchanged startled glances. "You're the chief's son?" Rebecca asked, the significance of this revelation washing over her. The boy nodded proudly. Nathaniel let out a low whistle. "Well, that changes things. If the Comanche find out white men wounded the chief's son and are hunting him, He left the sentence unfinished, but his expression spoke volumes. War, Rebecca whispered. They would see it as an act of war. At the very least, they'd demand blood for blood, Nathaniel agreed. And I can't say I'd blame them. Rebecca paced the small confines of the cabin, her mind racing. We need to get word to them, explain what happened, let them know Takwaho is safe. She turned to Nathaniel. Could you reach them? You said you have history with the Comanche. Nathaniel considered this, rubbing his stubbled jaw. It's possible. But even if I left now and rode hard, it would take at least 2 days to reach them. That leaves you and the boy alone with the Brenners coming back. I can handle myself, Rebecca insisted, though doubt crept into her voice. Against 3 armed men, maybe more if they bring friends. Nathaniel shook his head. That's not a fight you can win, Miss Bennet. Before she could respond, Takwaho spoke up again, his voice carrying a new urgency. He pointed to the window, then cupped a hand behind his ear in a listening gesture. The adults fell silent, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the normal evening sounds, crickets beginning their nightly chorus, a distant coyote's yip. Then came the faint but unmistakable creak of a wagon approaching from the direction of town. Nathaniel moved to the window, keeping to one side to avoid being silhouetted against the lamplight. Single wagon, he reported quietly. Moving slow. 1 driver looks like. Rebecca joined him, peering cautiously through the threadbare curtain. As the wagon drew closer, recognition dawned. It's Abigail Carson, she said with surprise. The midwife? Abigail Carson was one of the few people in Willow Creek who still treated Rebecca with a measure of kindness. A widow herself, she had delivered most of the town's children, including Rebecca's daughter years ago. While she didn't openly defy the town's ostracism of Rebecca, she occasionally stopped by with small gifts of tea or sugar, never staying long but maintaining a tenuous connection. Friend or foe? Nathaniel asked, his hand resting near his holstered. Revolver, friend, I think, Rebecca replied, as much as anyone from town can be. She instructed Takwaho to hide in the bedroom while she stepped onto the porch to greet the visitor. Nathaniel remained inside, out of sight, but within earshot. Abigail reined her ancient bay gelding to a stop before the cabin. Despite being well into her 60s, she descended from the wagon with practiced ease, her movements betraying none of the rheumatism that she often complained about. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her plain brown dress bore the practical hallmarks of a woman who prioritized function over fashion. "Evening, Rebecca," she called, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age, but otherwise strong. "Seems I've picked a fine time for a social call." Rebecca descended the porch steps cautiously. "It's late for visiting, Abigail. What brings you out here?" the older woman snorted. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries, girl. The Brenner boys are drinking heavy at Thornton's saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that you're harboring an Indian fugitive." She fixed Rebecca with a sharp gaze. "That true?" Rebecca hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. Abigail waved a hand impatiently. "Don't bother lying. I've been delivering babies and burying folks in this territory for 40 years. I can smell trouble brewing from 10 miles off." She lowered her voice. "Is the boy hurt bad?" Surprised by the directness of the question, Rebecca found herself answering honestly. "His leg was slashed. I stitched it. He's healing well." Abigail nodded approvingly. "You always did have a steady hand." She glanced toward the cabin, where Nathaniel's shadow was briefly visible through the window. "And you've found yourself a protector, I see. Good. You'll need one." "How did you know about the boy?" Rebecca asked. "Laundry doesn't hang itself out to dry," Abigail replied cryptically. "I've got eyes, and unlike most in this town, I use them for seeing rather than judging." She reached into her wagon and withdrew. "A small burlap sack. Brought you some supplies, flour, coffee, and bandages. Figure you might need them." As Rebecca accepted the offering, Abigail leaned closer. "They're planning to come for you at first light. Sheriffs deputized half the men in town, calling it a posse to hunt a dangerous Indian raiding party." Her weathered face creased with disgust. "It's an excuse for violence, nothing more." Cold dread settled in Rebecca's stomach. "How many?" 15, maybe 20 men. Most just looking for excitement, but the Brenners mean business." Abigail's eyes softened with concern. "You need to leave, Rebecca, tonight. This isn't a storm you can weather." "I can't," Rebecca replied, glancing back at the cabin. "The boy's still too weak for hard travel." Abigail studied her for a long moment. "You've changed," she observed. "Time was you'd have hidden behind those walls and hoped trouble passed you by." Rebecca touched her scarred cheek self-consciously. "Maybe I'm tired of hiding. Or maybe you've finally found something worth fighting for," the older woman suggested. She climbed back onto her wagon seat with a small grunt of effort. "Either way, I've done what I came to do. Warnings given, conscience clear." As she gathered the reins, Rebecca reached up to touch her arm. "Thank you, Abigail. Why risk helping us?" The midwife's smile held a lifetime of secret sorrows and quiet rebellions. "My first husband was Cheyenne. Town never knew. He died before we settled here. But I remember what it's like to love across boundaries others can't see past." She nodded toward the cabin. "That boy deserves a chance, same as any child. And you, girl, you deserve to remember you're still alive." With a flick of the reins, she turned the wagon around. "There's an old trapper's cabin near Harlow's Ridge," she called back. 3 miles north through the cottonwood grove. Might make a decent hiding place if someone needed one." As the wagon disappeared into the gathering darkness, Rebecca stood motionless, processing all she had learned. When she finally returned inside, she found Nathaniel and Takwaho waiting expectantly. "We need to leave," she announced. "Tonight. A posse's coming. At dawn, too many to fight." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "I heard. Where will we go?" Rebecca explained Abigail's suggestion about the trapper's cabin, relieved when Nathaniel confirmed he knew its location. "It's defensible," he agreed, "backed against the ridge with only one approach. We could hold it for a day or two if necessary." They worked quickly, gathering only essentials: food, water, medical supplies, and ammunition for Nathaniel's revolver and Rebecca's hunting rifle. Takwaho watched their preparations with solemn understanding, carefully repacking his small leather pouch and securing it inside his borrowed shirt. As Rebecca packed the last of their supplies, she paused by the mantelpiece where a small daguerreotype stood in a tarnished silver frame, the only image she had of Samuel and their daughter. Her fingers hovered over it uncertainly. "Bring it," Nathaniel said quietly from behind her. "Some. And things aren't meant to be left behind." She nodded gratefully, wrapping the frame in a handkerchief and tucking it into her bag. "I'm ready." Outside, Nathaniel had already saddled his grey mare and was securing their packs to the saddle. "You and the boy will ride," he explained. "I'll lead on foot. Quieter that way, and we'll avoid putting too much strain on his leg." Rebecca helped Takwaho mount, noting how he bit his lip against the pain, but made no sound of complaint. She climbed up behind him, feeling strange atop a horse after so many years of walking everywhere. The boy leaned back against her, his small body warm and trusting. With Nathaniel leading the mare by the bridle, they set off into the night, keeping to the shadows of the tree line that ran alongside the creek. The moon was mercifully absent, covered by clouds that promised rain before morning. Rebecca didn't look back at her cabin, the only home she had known for years. Something told her she might never see it again, and some goodbyes were better left unspoken. They traveled in silence, the only sounds the soft thud of the horses' hooves on damp earth and the occasional call of a night bird. Nathaniel moved, with the confidence of a man accustomed to navigating by starlight, occasionally raising a hand to signal a change in direction or a moment to pause and listen. After nearly 2 hours of steady progress, the land began to rise gently beneath them. The cottonwood grove Abigail had mentioned appeared as deeper shadows against the night sky, the pale undersides of leaves occasionally catching what little light filtered through the clouds. "Not much farther," Nathaniel murmured, leading them, deeper into the trees. The trapper's cabin materialized like a solid shadow, nestled against the base of a limestone ridge. It was smaller than Rebecca had imagined, little more than a one-room shelter with a sloped roof and a single window. A crude stone chimney rose from one end, and the door hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. Nathaniel handed the reins to Rebecca and approached cautiously, revolver drawn. After a thorough inspection, he signaled that it was safe to enter. The interior was Spartan but serviceable. A plank table with a 3-legged stool, a narrow pallet in one corner, and a small stone fireplace. Dust covered everything, but the roof appeared sound, and the walls showed no major gaps that would let in the wind or rain. "Home sweet home," Nathaniel remarked dryly as he helped Takwaho dismount. "At least until we figure out our next move." Rebecca busied herself making the cabin habitable while Nathaniel tended to the horse, securing it in a small lean-to behind the structure. Takwaho, determined to be useful despite his injury, helped clear dust from the table and stool using a bundled rag. As Rebecca spread their bedrolls on the floor, a sudden thought struck her. "We never discussed a plan beyond reaching this place," she realized aloud. "What happens tomorrow, the next day?" Nathaniel returned from securing the perimeter, bringing with him the damp smell of impending rain. "Options are limited," he admitted, checking the load in his revolver before setting it on the table. "We can try to outrun the posse, head west toward Comanche territory, or we can stand our ground here and hope they don't find us. Or," Rebecca prompted, sensing he had another idea, "or I can go alone, ride hard to contact the boys' people," he said quietly. "Bring them back here." "That could take days," Rebecca objected. "And there's no guarantee you'd find them or that they wouldn't kill you on sight." Nathaniel smiled grimly. "Risk I'm willing to take." Takwaho, who had been following their conversation with focused attention, suddenly spoke up. He pointed to the pendant around his neck, then to Nathaniel, speaking several phrases in Comanche. "I think he's saying the pendant would prove you come in peace," Rebecca translated uncertainly. The boy nodded vigorously, removing the necklace and holding it out to Nathaniel. He spoke again, making gestures that suggested riding swiftly, then pointed to the pendant and back to himself. "A token from the chief's son," Nathaniel mused, accepting the offering with careful respect. "Might just keep me alive long enough to deliver the message." He studied the obsidian crescent, turning it over in his calloused hands. "I'll leave at first light, while the posse is busy searching your cabin." Rebecca wanted to object, to point out all the ways this plan could fail, but she knew they had few alternatives. "How will you find us again when you return with help?" "I'll find you," he said simply, with a quiet confidence that somehow made her believe him, as if punctuating their decision. Rain began to fall, pattering softly against the cabin's roof. The sound was oddly comforting, a natural curtain drawing across their hiding place. They ate a cold supper of jerky and hardtack, conserving their supplies and avoiding a fire that might be spotted from a distance. Afterward, Takwaho fell asleep. Almost immediately, curled on his bedroll like a much younger child, the journey having taxed his recovering strength. Rebecca and Nathaniel sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain and the boy's steady breathing. After a while, she found herself studying her unlikely protector, the way he kept his back to the wall, eyes regularly scanning the cabin's single window and door, hands never far from his weapon. He had the watchful stillness of a man who had Learned vigilance through hard experience. You never told me how you came to be with the Brenner brothers, she said softly, careful not to wake Takwaho. Nathaniel's expression darkened. Wasn't by choice. They found me prospecting along Blackhorn Creek, decided I was on their claim. His fingers absently traced the scar on his knuckles. 3 against 1. Didn't end well for me. They took my gold, my good horse, everything, but my life. How did you escape? A hint of grim satisfaction crossed his face. They got careless, thought I was too beaten to run, made camp near where they'd encountered your young friend. During the chaos, I slipped away. Rebecca nodded, slowly. And instead of putting miles between yourself and them, you came looking for the boy. Seemed like the decent thing to do, he replied with a shrug. Couldn't save the others. The implications of his words hung heavy in the air between them. Others? She prompted quietly. Nathaniel's pale eyes took on a haunted quality. There were 5 children gathering herbs near the creek. The Brenners came upon them suddenly. 2 escaped immediately into the trees. 2 weren't so fortunate. He paused, his jaw tightening. Takwaho stayed behind, tried to help the youngest girl. That's when Wade slashed him with his hunting knife. Horror and anger flashed through Rebecca in equal measure. Did they— No, Nathaniel interrupted, understanding her unspoken question. The girl got away during the struggle, but not before Curtis shot at her. Don't know if she was hit. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, trying to process the depth of cruelty revealed by his account. And they're the ones leading a posse to deliver justice, she said bitterly. Justice has a funny way of getting twisted out here, Nathaniel observed, especially when it comes to folks with different colored skin. He glanced at her scarred face. Or those who don't fit the town's idea of normal. Rebecca touched her. Scars self-consciously, an old habit she thought she'd broken years ago. Is it that obvious? How do they treat me? Nathaniel's expression softened. It's written in the way you hold yourself, like you're braced for the next blow. I recognized it because I've worn that same look. He hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, those scars don't hide the person. Beneath them, not to those with eyes to see, something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Rebecca's chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its quieter cousin, possibility. She looked away, unsure how to respond to such direct kindness after years of avoidance and judgment. You should rest, she said finally. You have a long journey ahead tomorrow. Nathaniel nodded, respecting her need to retreat from vulnerability. I'll take my first watch. Wake you in a few hours. Rebecca settled onto her bedroll, listening to the steady drum of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of floorboards as Nathaniel moved between window and door, maintaining his vigilant guard. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, she felt strangely at peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't facing danger alone. She glanced at Takwaho's sleeping form, marveling at how this wounded child had inadvertently brought new purpose to her isolated existence. Whatever came next, whether pursuit, rescue, or something in between, she had chosen her path and would see it through. Sleep claimed her eventually, deep and dreamless despite the hard floor beneath her back. She didn't stir when Nathaniel gently draped his coat over her shoulders as the night turned colder, nor when he paused to study her face in the dim light of pre-dawn, his expression thoughtful and resolute. Morning arrived with watery sunlight, filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. Rebecca woke to find Takwaho already up, attempting to sweep the floor with a makeshift broom fashioned from bound twigs. Nathaniel stood by the door, fully dressed and equipped for travel, the obsidian pendant now hanging around his neck, alongside a worn silver compass. Storm passed, he reported, nodding toward the window. Ground soft, good for making time, bad for hiding tracks. I'll lead any pursuit away from here before cutting west. Rebecca rose, quickly folding her bedroll and running fingers through her tangled hair. "How long will you be gone?" "4 days, if luck's with me. 6, if it's not." He checked his revolver one last time before holstering it. "If I'm not back at 7, we'll wait," she insisted, "as long as it's safe to do so." Nathaniel nodded, his expression grave but determined. "Keep the rifle loaded and close. Don't use the fireplace during daylight. Smoke can be seen for miles. And trust your instincts. They've kept you alive this long." He knelt beside Takwaho, meeting the boy's solemn gaze directly. "I'll find your father," he promised in simple English the child could understand. "Bring him here." He touched the pendant, then placed his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. Takwaho responded with dignity beyond his years, speaking a phrase in Comanche that sounded like a blessing or a protection. As Nathaniel prepared to depart, Rebecca walked with him to where his horse was tethered. The morning air was fresh with the scent of rain-washed earth and pine, the forest around them vibrant with renewed life. "Be careful," she said quietly. "The Brenners aren't the only danger out there." "I've survived worse odds," he replied with a faint smile. "Keep the boy safe, and yourself." On impulse, Rebecca reached into her pocket and withdrew the burgundy silk ribbon, Samuel's last gift, the one thing of beauty she had allowed herself to keep. She held it out to Nathaniel. "A token for a token," she explained, "to ensure you find your way back." Nathaniel accepted the ribbon with gentle reverence, seeming to understand its significance without explanation. He carefully tied it around his wrist, securing it with a knot that wouldn't easily come undone. "I'll return," he said simply. Rebecca watched him mount and ride away, the morning mist swallowing his figure until all that remained was the fading sound of hoofbeats. She stood there long after he had disappeared, one hand pressed against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree, the other unconsciously touching her scarred cheek. Behind her, Takwaho appeared in the cabin doorway, leaning on his makeshift crutch. His dark eyes held wisdom far beyond his years as he watched her watching the empty trail. "He come back," the boy said with certainty, his English improving by the day. Rebecca turned to him with a small smile. "Yes," she agreed, "but until then we have work to do." Together they returned to the cabin, closing the door against whatever dangers the day might bring. 2 days passed in the trapper's cabin with agonizing slowness. Rebecca established a cautious routine, mornings spent gathering berries and edible plants from the surrounding forest, afternoons devoted to teaching Takwaho more English words and listening to him practice his growing vocabulary. The boy was an eager student, his intelligence evident in how quickly he absorbed new information. By the second day, they could carry on simple conversations, finding unexpected moments of connection despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "Your home?" Takwaho asked during one such exchange, mimicking the shape of a house. With his hands, "Miss it?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Not the place," she answered finally, "but the freedom, knowing where everything is." The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "My people," he offered, "always moving. Home is—" He struggled for the word, then touched his chest. "Here." "In your heart," Rebecca supplied. "Yes. Home in heart." On the morning of the 3rd day, Takwaho's wound had healed enough that he could walk short distances without the crutch, though he still favored his good leg. Rebecca checked the stitches carefully, pleased with how cleanly the edges had knit together. Another week, and she could remove them completely. "You heal fast," she observed, applying a fresh coating of honey before rewrapping the leg. Takwaho smiled. "Grandfather say, strong spirit, strong body." As she secured the bandage, a sound from outside froze her in place, the distant crack of a branch breaking beneath a heavy foot. Someone was approaching through the forest. Rebecca pressed a finger to her lips, signaling silence. Takwaho immediately understood, sliding from the table where she'd been tending his wound and moving soundlessly to retrieve her rifle from its place by the door. He handed it to her with solemn efficiency, then took up position beside the cabin's only window, peering cautiously through a gap in the weathered boards that covered it. 3 days of vigilance had prepared them for this moment. Without speaking, they followed the plan they had rehearsed. Rebecca positioned herself behind the solid oak table, which they had turned on its side to serve as a barricade, while Takwaho retreated to the hiding place they had created, a narrow space behind the stone chimney concealed by a stack of firewood. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied now by the soft nickering of a horse. Rebecca's finger tensed on the rifle's trigger as a shadow fell across the threshold. The door, deliberately left unlatched, creaked open slowly. "Rebecca," a familiar voice called softly. "Takwaho?" Relief flooded through her as Nathaniel's tall figure filled the doorway, hat in hand, exhaustion evident in the slump of his broad shoulders. She lowered the rifle immediately. "You're back early," she said, unable to keep the gladness from her voice as she rose from behind the overturned table. Nathaniel stepped inside, his travel-worn appearance telling of hard riding with little rest. Dust coated his clothing, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. The obsidian pendant still hung around his neck, and the burgundy ribbon remained tied securely around his wrist, though now frayed at the edges. "Didn't have to go as far as expected," he explained, as Takwaho emerged from his hiding place. "Met a Comanche hunting party a day's ride west of here. They'd been searching for our young friend since he disappeared." The boy rushed forward, speaking rapidly in his native tongue, his usual composure forgotten in his excitement. Nathaniel rested a hand briefly on Takwaho's shoulder, then continued his explanation to Rebecca. "The chief, Takwaho's father, is camped with 75 warriors at Falcon Ridge, less than half a day's ride from here. They were preparing to attack Willow Creek, believing the town was responsible for the boy's disappearance and the death of the other children." Rebecca's blood ran cold at the thought of what such an attack would mean, not just for the guilty parties like the Brenners, but for innocent townspeople caught in the violence. "Were you able to explain what really happened?" Nathaniel nodded. "The pendant helped convince them to listen. I told them everything, about the Brenner brothers' attack on the children, about you finding and healing Takwaho, about the posse hunting him." He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. "I may have emphasized your bravery in protecting the chief's son at risk to your own life." "And they believed you?" she asked, somewhat skeptical that her actions would carry weight with Comanche warriors. "The hunting party sent 2 riders ahead to inform the chief. The rest escorted me back to make sure I wasn't leading them into a trap." Nathaniel moved to the cabin's single window, peering out cautiously. "They're waiting in the woods now, watching the cabin." Rebecca joined him at the window, though she could see nothing but trees and underbrush. "What happens next?" "The chief is coming here himself with his warriors. They should arrive by midday." Nathaniel turned to face her directly. "There's something else you should know. The posse found your cabin yesterday morning. When they discovered it empty, they split up. Half continued searching this area, the other half returned to town." A knot formed in Rebecca's stomach. "And my cabin?" Nathaniel's expression grew somber. "They burned it. Said it was cleansing witch property." The news struck her like a physical blow. Though she had suspected something like this might happen, the reality of it, the finality, left her momentarily speechless. Everything she had built over the years, every remnant of her life with Samuel, every scrap of independence she had, you fought for, gone. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said quietly, watching her face. Rebecca took a deep breath, steadying herself against the wave of loss. "It was just a place," she said, echoing her earlier words to Takwaho. "Just wood and stone." The boy moved to her side, slipping his small hand into hers. Home in heart, he reminded her solemnly. She squeezed his hand gratefully, drawing strength from his resilience. Yes, home in heart. They spent the next few hours preparing for the arrival of the Comanche party. Rebecca tidied the cabin as best she could, more for something to do than from any real concern about appearances. Nathaniel checked and rechecked his weapons, a habit born of years on the frontier. Takwaho seemed both excited and nervous, constantly moving between the window and door, eager for the first glimpse of his people. It was just past noon when they heard it, the rhythmic drumming of many hooves approaching from the west. Nathaniel stepped outside first, positioning himself protectively in front of the cabin. Rebecca and Takwaho followed, the boy standing tall despite his lingering injury. They emerged into dazzling sunlight, the forest canopy opening above the small clearing where the cabin stood. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then fell silent, as the Comanche party reached the edge of the trees. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, like shadows taking solid form, riders appeared one by one from between the trunks. Rebecca had seen Comanche warriors at a distance before, but never like this, mounted on magnificent horses, faces painted with intricate designs of red and black, feathers and fur adorning their braided hair. Some carried lances decorated with scalps and feathers, others had bows or rifles across their backs. All wore expressions of stern assessment as they formed a half-circle around the clearing. From their midst rode a single figure on a copper-colored stallion with white spiral patterns painted across its flanks. Unlike the others, he wore a headdress of eagle feathers and mountain lion pelts draped across his shoulders. His face bore the lines of age and wisdom, but his back remained straight, his presence commanding respect without effort. Takwaho straightened at the sight of him, a mixture of joy and pride crossing his young face. "Father," he whispered. The chief raised his hand, and the warriors behind him went completely still. For a long moment he studied the three figures before the cabin, Nathaniel standing slightly forward, hand resting near but not on his holstered revolver. Rebecca beside him, her scarred face lifted to meet his gaze directly, and Takwaho, small but dignified, his wounded leg still wrapped in the white bandage that stood out starkly against his copper skin. Then the chief spoke a single word, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. Takwaho immediately stepped forward, moving as quickly as his healing leg allowed, crossing the open space between the cabin and the mounted warriors. The chief dismounted in one fluid motion, dropping to one knee to embrace his son. The gathered warriors remained impassive, but the emotion between father and child was unmistakable. They spoke rapidly in Comanche, Takwaho gesturing occasionally toward Rebecca and Nathaniel as he explained what had happened. After several minutes, the chief rose to his full height and approached the cabin. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing. The scars across his chest and arms told of many battles survived, many honors earned. "I am Black Hawk," he said in surprisingly clear English. "Chief of the Numunu band that hunts these territories." He inclined his head slightly toward Nathaniel. "The rider with the stone of my ancestors has spoken of you both. My son confirms his words." Rebecca found her voice, though it emerged smaller than she intended. "Takwaho is a brave child. It was an honor to help him." Black Hawk's gaze shifted to her, his eyes lingering briefly on her scarred face, before meeting her eyes with the same direct assessment his son had shown. "You have suffered your own wounds," he observed, "yet you did not turn away from my son's pain." "Any decent person would have done the same," she replied. Something like amusement flickered in the chief's eyes. "Many of your people would disagree." He turned to Nathaniel. "And you, Ghost Rider, you escaped your captors to warn my son, then risked death to bring word to me." Nathaniel removed the obsidian pendant from around his neck, offering it back to the chief with a gesture of respect. "I repaid a debt," he said simply. "Nothing more." Black Hawk accepted the pendant but made no move to put it on. Instead, he studied it in his palm, then looked back at the two people who had saved his son. "There is a saying among my people. When you save a life, you become responsible for that life. By this measure, you now share in my son's path." Before either could respond to this pronouncement, a disturbance rippled through the line of warriors. Several turned their horses, facing east toward the forest. Black Hawk raised his hand, signaling for silence, his head tilted in a listening pose that reminded Rebecca forcefully of Takwaho. "Riders approach," he said, his tone sharpening. "Many, moving quickly." Nathaniel moved immediately to the edge of the clearing, peering through the trees in the direction the warriors were facing. "The posse," he confirmed grimly, "must have spotted the Comanche tracks and followed them here." Rebecca's heart sank. Just when resolution seemed within reach, the conflict they had tried so hard to avoid was bearing down upon them. If the posse and the Comanche warriors clashed here, blood would flow on both sides, potentially igniting a wider war that would consume the entire territory. Black Hawk gave rapid orders in Comanche. The warriors spread out, taking positions. Among the trees, weapons at the ready. Takwaho was quickly lifted onto his father's horse and led away by one of the older warriors, disappearing into the forest for safety. "Wait," Rebecca called, stepping forward. "There doesn't have to be fighting. Most of the men in that posse are just following orders. They don't understand what really happened. The white men who harmed my son and killed our children must answer for their crimes," Black Hawk replied, his voice hard as flint. "Blood must balance blood." "The Brenner brothers, yes," she agreed urgently. "They're the guilty ones, but not the others, not the whole town." The chief studied her with narrowed eyes. "You defend the same people who burned your home and called you a witch?" "I defend innocent lives," she countered. Mothers, children, people who had nothing to do with what happened to Takwaho." Black Hawk exchanged a long look with Nathaniel, who had returned to Rebecca's side. "What would you suggest, scarred one?" Rebecca thought quickly, aware that time was running out. "Let me speak to them first. Let me try to make them understand what really happened. If they see me alive and unharmed, talking freely with you, it might prevent bloodshed." The sound of approaching horses grew louder as the posse drew nearer. Black Hawk considered her proposal, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded once, a gesture of regal permission. "You may try words before we try weapons," he conceded. "But if they attack, we will defend with full force." "Fair enough," Nathaniel said, stepping forward. "I'm coming with you," he told. "Rebecca," his tone brooking no argument. Together they moved toward the eastern edge of the clearing, positioning themselves where they would be visible to the approaching riders. Behind them, the Comanche warriors readied their weapons, melting into the forest with such skill that even knowing they were there, Rebecca could barely discern their positions. The posse burst through the tree line moments later. 20 men, on lathered horses, rifles ready, expressions grim with purpose. Sheriff Davis led them, his star-shaped badge catching the sunlight. Beside him rode the Brenner brothers, Wade's face twisted with anticipation of violence, Curtis scanning the clearing with narrowed eyes. They pulled up short at the sight of Rebecca and Nathaniel standing calmly in their path, clearly not prisoners or hostages. "Rebecca Bennett," Sheriff Davis called, confusion evident in his voice. "Step aside, ma'am. We're tracking a Comanche war party." "I know exactly who you're tracking, Sheriff," she replied steadily. "And why? But you don't know the whole story." Wade Brenner spat into the dirt. "Ain't no story needs telling. These savages attacked us, and we're here to deliver justice." "Is that what you call what you did to those children by the creek?" Nathaniel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Justice." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the posse. Several of the men exchanged glances, clearly hearing this accusation for the first time. "What's he talking about, Wade?" one of the townsmen asked. "Don't listen to him," Wade snarled. "He's in league with the witch and the Injuns." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "A week ago, the Brenner brothers and Roy Dawson attacked 5 Comanche children who were gathering herbs by Blackhorn Creek. They killed 2, one they wounded, a boy named Takwaho, the son of the chief whose warriors now surround this clearing." A murmur ran through the posse as men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, looking around at the seemingly empty forest with new wariness. "She's lying," Curtis Brenner shouted. "Those Injun brats attacked us. We were defending ourselves." "Against children?" Rebecca challenged. "The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest was a little girl of perhaps 6. She fixed Wade with a contemptuous stare. "Is that why you slashed Takwaho with your hunting knife? Because you feared for your life against a child?" Sheriff Davis raised his hand, silencing the Brenners' protests. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Bennett. Do you have proof?" "I have." "The testimony of a witness," she replied, gesturing to Nathaniel, "a man these brothers held captive, who saw everything. I have the wound I treated on the boy's leg, a clean slash from a blade, not an animal attack or accident. And I have the word of the boy himself, who has no reason to lie." "The word of an Injun ain't worth spit," Roy Dawson growled from his position behind the sheriff. "Perhaps not to you," came a new voice as Black Hawk stepped from the trees, tall and imposing in his ceremonial dress. "But the word of a chief might carry more weight." The effect on the posse was immediate. Several men raised their rifles while others drew back in alarm. Sheriff Davis held up his hand again, preventing any hasty action. "I am Black Hawk," the chief announced. "My warriors are positioned in these woods, arrows nocked, rifles aimed. If blood flows here today, few of you will ride home to tell of it." A tense silence fell over the clearing. Rebecca could sense the fear rippling through the posse, see the calculation in Sheriff Davis's eyes as he weighed their chances. The next few moments would determine whether they all lived or died. "What do you want?" the sheriff finally asked. Addressing the chief directly, "Justice," Black Hawk replied simply. "For my son who was wounded, for our children who were killed." Wade Brenner suddenly spurred his horse forward, rifles swinging toward the chief. "Die, you red devil!" Multiple. Things happened at once. Nathaniel drew and fired in one fluid motion, the bullet striking Wade's rifle and knocking it from his hands. Black Hawk remained perfectly still, not even flinching as the shot rang out. And from the forest around them came the distinctive sound of bowstrings being drawn back, though no warriors were visible. "The next shot will not miss," Black Hawk stated calmly. "Choose wisely, Sheriff. Is the life of this child killer worth the lives of all your men?" Sheriff Davis's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "Lower your weapons," he ordered the posse. "All of you, now." Most complied immediately, though Curtis Brenner and Roy Dawson hesitated, eyes darting between Wade, who was nursing his injured hand, and the sheriff. "I said now," Davis barked. Reluctantly they obeyed, lowering their rifles. "These men attacked our children unprovoked," Black Hawk continued. "By your law and ours, their lives are forfeit. But I offer an alternative." He turned to Rebecca. "This woman has shown mercy to my son. In honor of her actions, I will show mercy to your town." Relief washed over Rebecca as she realized what the chief was proposing, a path away from full-scale war. "Give us these 3 men," Black Hawk said, pointing to Wade, Curtis, and Roy. "They will face Comanche justice for their crimes against our children. In return, there will be peace between my people and your town." Sheriff Davis hesitated clearly, torn. "I can't just hand over 3 white men to face Indian justice," he protested. "The territorial governor would have my badge." "Then you condemn many more to die," Black Hawk replied evenly. My warriors have been gathering for days. 75 are with me now. More arrive each dawn. We know where your women and children sleep. We know when your men ride out to tend cattle. We can strike like lightning and vanish like mist." The threat hung in the air, all the more terrifying for the matter-of-fact way it was delivered. Several members of the posse looked to the sheriff imploringly, clearly unwilling to die for the Brenner brothers' crimes. "There is another way," Rebecca suggested, stepping into the space between the two leaders. "A trial conducted fairly, with witnesses from both sides. Let them answer for their crimes before the territorial judge when he comes through next month." Black Hawk's expression remained skeptical. White judges rarely deliver justice when Indian lives are concerned. "This one might be different," Nathaniel interjected. "Judge Hammond has a reputation for fairness, and with testimony from both sides, including yours as chief, the evidence would be overwhelming." The sheriff seized on this alternative eagerly. "Yes, a proper trial. That's the American way." Black Hawk considered this proposal, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he spoke again. "I will accept this trial on one condition. Until the judge arrives, these 3 men will be held in your jail under guard by both your people and mine. 2 of my warriors will remain in your town to ensure they do not escape or receive special treatment." Sheriff Davis looked as though he wanted to object but thought better of it. "That's irregular, but under the circumstances I can agree to those terms." Relief spread through the posse, men visibly relaxing as the immediate threat of slaughter receded. Only the Brenner brothers and Roy Dawson remained tense, their expressions a mixture of fury and fear as they realized they would not escape consequences for their actions. "Then it is decided," Black Hawk declared. He made a subtle gesture, and 2 warriors emerged from the forest, taking up positions beside the sheriff. As preparations were made to take the accused men back to town, Rebecca found herself standing apart, watching the unlikely peace negotiation unfold. Nathaniel joined her, his expression thoughtful. "You may have just prevented a war," he observed quietly. She shook her head. "I just showed them another path. They chose to take it. Sometimes that's all peace requires. Someone brave enough to suggest an alternative to bloodshed." He studied her face, his pale eyes reflecting something she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Admiration. "What will you do now? Your cabin's gone." Before she could answer, Takwaho appeared from the trees, limping slightly but moving with determination. He had changed into traditional Comanche clothing, a fringed buckskin shirt, leggings and moccasins that had clearly been made for him. Behind him walked a woman whose resemblance to Black Hawk marked her as likely his mother, the chief's wife. The boy approached Rebecca without hesitation, taking her hands in his. "Come," he said in English, his eyes earnest. "With us." Rebecca looked up in surprise to find Black Hawk watching this exchange. The chief inclined his head slightly. "My son wishes you to join our camp," he explained, "to continue teaching him your language and perhaps to learn some of ours." He glanced at her scarred face. "Among the Numunu, scars are marks of survival, not shame. They tell the story of a strong spirit." The offer stunned her. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Nathaniel suggested, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Unless you've got a better place to be." Rebecca looked at Takwaho's hopeful expression, at the unexpected acceptance in Black Hawk's eyes, at Nathaniel's encouraging smile. For the first time in years, she felt something unfurl in her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten, belonging. "Yes," she said finally, squeezing Takwaho's small hands. "I'll come." The boy's face lit with joy, and he immediately began, chattering to his mother in Comanche, clearly explaining who Rebecca was and what she had done for him. The woman, whose name Rebecca would later learn was Swift Deer, regarded her with cautious gratitude, then stepped forward to touch her hand briefly in a gesture of acceptance. As the Brenner brothers and Roy Dawson were led away under heavy guard, and arrangements were made for Rebecca to accompany the Comanche back to their camp, she found herself standing once more beside Nathaniel. "What about you?" she asked. "Where will you go?" He touched the burgundy ribbon still tied around his wrist, his expression softening. "Thought I might stay close by for a while. The Comanche could use someone who understands white ways, especially with a trial coming." He met her gaze directly. "And I find myself reluctant to travel far from certain new acquaintances." Rebecca felt warmth rise to her cheeks, unfamiliar after so many years of emotional isolation. "I would like that," she admitted quietly. As the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the clearing, Rebecca took one last look at the trapper's cabin, another temporary shelter she was leaving behind. But this time, she wasn't running from something, but toward something. A new beginning, unexpected connections, possibilities she had never imagined. With Takwaho's hand firmly in hers and Nathaniel walking beside her, she joined the Comanche riders as they prepared to depart. The warriors who had seemed so intimidating hours before now nodded to her with respect, making space in their formation for the scarred woman who had earned their chief's approval. Black Hawk, mounted once more on his magnificent painted stallion, raised his hand in a signal to move out. As the company began to ride westward, Takwaho looked up at Rebecca from his position on his father's horse and smiled, a bright, hopeful expression that transcended language and culture. "Home," he said simply, pointing toward the horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of fire and gold. Home in heart, the territorial courthouse in Fort Gibson stood as a testament to the ambitious vision of civilization pushing westward. A two-story brick structure with white columns and tall windows, seemingly transplanted from some eastern city and dropped incongruously onto the frontier. It was here, 6 weeks after the confrontation at the trapper's cabin, that the trial of the Brenner brothers and Roy Dawson began. Rebecca sat on a hard wooden bench in the crowded courthouse, her appearance markedly different from the isolated woman who had once lived at the edge of Willow Creek. She wore a new dress of soft buckskin, adorned with subtle beadwork around the collar, a gift from Swift Deer, who had welcomed her into the Comanche camp with growing warmth as the weeks passed. Rebecca's hair, once pulled back in a severe knot, now hung in a single braid down her back, interwoven with a thin strand of red and white beads. But the most striking change was in her demeanor. She sat straight-backed and confident, no longer hunching to hide her scarred face from curious eyes. When townspeople from Willow Creek glanced her way, some with hostility, others with bewilderment, she met their gazes directly, neither challenging nor retreating. Beside her sat Nathaniel, his frontier attire exchanged for the cleanest shirt and vest he owned, though he had flatly refused to remove his revolver despite the bailiff's objections. His weathered features remained impassive, but his hand occasionally brushed against hers on the bench between them, a small gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the whispering spectators. On Rebecca's other side sat Takwaho, nearly unrecognizable from the wounded, frightened boy she had found behind her toolshed. His leg had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that would fade with time. Dressed in a mixture of traditional Comanche clothing and a white man's cotton shirt, he sat with the natural dignity that marked his father's bearing, his dark eyes missing nothing as he observed the proceedings. Chief Black Hawk occupied the bench directly behind them, flanked by 2 of his most trusted warriors. His presence in the courthouse had caused a sensation when he arrived, many of the settlers having never seen a Comanche chief up close. He wore no war paint today, but his ceremonial dress and the eagle feathers in his hair marked his status unmistakably. Judge Hammond entered the courtroom with brisk efficiency, his black robes billowing as he took his seat at the bench. A man. In his 60s, with iron-grey hair and piercing eyes, he had a reputation for harsh but fair judgments, one of the few territorial judges who made no distinction between white and Indian testimony when weighing evidence. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. The Brenner brothers and Roy Dawson were led in, shackled at the wrists and ankles. 6 weeks in the Willow Creek jail had not been kind to them. Wade's face was haggard, his once arrogant posture diminished. Curtis kept his gaze fixed on the floor, while Roy continually scanned the room with nervous eyes, as if seeking an escape route. As the charges were read, murder of 2 Comanche children, attempted murder of 3 others, assault with a deadly weapon. Rebecca felt Takwaho tense beside her. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent reminder of how far they had come from that day by the creek. The prosecution presented its case first. The territorial prosecutor, a young man named Henry Coleman, with an Eastern education and idealistic notions of justice, had initially approached the case with skepticism, but after interviewing the witnesses and examining the evidence, he had become a passionate advocate for the victims. "Your Honor," Coleman addressed the judge, "the evidence will show that these 3 men deliberately attacked 5 Comanche children who were peacefully gathering herbs along Blackhorn Creek. When the children attempted to flee, the defendants pursued them, shooting 2 dead and severely wounding another with a hunting knife. These were not acts of self-defense, as the defendants claim, but calculated violence against the most vulnerable members of the Comanche tribe." The defense attorney, a local lawyer named Milton Greaves, who represented all 3 defendants, argued that the men had been defending themselves against what they perceived as a Comanche raiding party. His arguments were undermined, however, by the inconsistencies in his client's testimonies and the physical evidence that contradicted their claims. When Nathaniel took the stand to testify about what he had witnessed while held captive by the Brenners, his calm, detailed account silenced the courtroom. He described the children's terror, the casual cruelty of the brothers, and the particular viciousness with which Wade had slashed at Takwaho when the boy attempted to help the youngest girl escape. "They were laughing," Nathaniel concluded, his voice steady but tight with controlled anger, "hunting those children like it was a sport." Wade Brenner surged to his feet at this, chains rattling. "He's lying. They attacked us first." "Sit down, Mr. Brenner," Judge Hammond ordered sharply. "You'll have your chance to testify." Rebecca testified next, describing how she had found Takwaho wounded and frightened, how she had treated his injury, and the subsequent events that led to the confrontation at the trapper's cabin. When asked by the prosecutor why she had risked her safety for a Comanche child, her answer was simple. "He was a child in pain," she said. "Nothing else mattered." The most powerful testimony came from Takwaho himself, speaking through an interpreter provided by the court, though occasionally using the English words Rebecca had taught him. He recounted the attack with the clear-eyed precision of a child who had seen too much too young. "We were gathering yucca root for my mother's medicine," he explained. "My cousin's singing bird saw them first, 3 men on horses watching us from the ridge. She told us to run, but they were too fast." His voice remained steady as he described how the men had shot his cousin Little Wolf and his friend Rising Sun. "I tried to help Small Fawn escape. The big one with the red beard caught me, cut me here." He touched his leg where the scar remained. "I hit him with a rock and ran." When asked to identify the man who had cut him, Takwaho pointed without hesitation to Wade Brenner. The oldest Brenner glared back with undisguised hatred, making a subtle throat-cutting gesture that the judge immediately reprimanded him for. Chief Blackhawk testified last, speaking in fluent English that surprised many in the courtroom. He described finding the bodies of the 2 slain children. the impact on their families, and the near war that had been averted only through Rebecca's intervention. "My people have suffered many losses at the hands of white settlers," he said, his deep voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. "Land taken, treaties broken, lives ended. But even in war, the Numunu do not target children. There is no honor in such acts. These men must face justice not only for my people, but for the sake of their own people's honor." The defense presented its case weakly, hampered by the defendant's changing stories and the damning physical evidence. When Wade Brenner took the stand, his attempts to portray the children as threatening aggressors fell apart under cross-examination. Why would 5 unarmed children, the oldest no more than 12, attack 3 grown men with rifles? Coleman asked. "They're savages," Wade spat. "Born killers, all of them." His hatred, naked and unreasoning, did more to convince the jury of his guilt than any witness testimony could have. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. Judge Hammond sentenced the Brenner brothers to hanging for the murders, while Roy Dawson received 20 years hard labor for his lesser role in the attacks. As the condemned men were led away, Wade Brenner turned toward Rebecca, his face contorted with rage. "This is your fault, witch," he shouted. "You'll burn in hell for this." Rebecca met his gaze evenly, unflinching. "I've already walked through fire," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent courtroom. "And I'm still here." The bailiff dragged Wade away, his curses fading down the hallway. Judge Hammond, unusually, stepped down from the bench to approach Chief Blackhawk directly. "I hope this verdict brings some measure of peace to your people," he said, extending his hand. The chief accepted the handshake with solemn dignity. "Justice is the beginning," he replied. "The rest depends on what follows." Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight bathed the town square in golden light. Townspeople lingered in small groups, discussing the verdict in hushed tones. Some nodded respectfully as Rebecca, Nathaniel, Takwaho, and the Comanche delegation emerged. Others turned away, uncomfortable with the outcome despite its justice. Abigail Carson, the midwife who had warned Rebecca about the posse, approached with a tentative smile. "You look well," she observed, her eyes taking in Rebecca's. "Changed appearance, better than I've seen you look in years." "I am well," Rebecca confirmed. "Thank you for your help that night. It made all the difference." The older woman glanced at Nathaniel, noting how he stood protectively near Rebecca. "Found yourself some good company too, I see." Her smile widened, knowingly. About time. As they prepared to depart, Sheriff Davis approached, his expression conflicted but determined. He addressed Chief Blackhawk directly. "I want to apologize," he said stiffly. "Not just for the Brenners, but for not seeing what was happening in my own territory." The chief studied him for a moment before responding. "A wise leader learns from his mistakes," he said finally. "We will see if you are wise." The sheriff nodded, accepting the conditional nature of the peace between them. "For what it's worth," he added, turning to Rebecca, "the town council voted yesterday. Your land is still yours if you want it back." Rebecca was surprised by the unexpected offer. The burned ruins of her cabin held painful memories, but the land itself had been her home for many years. "I'll consider it," she said non-committally. As they rode out of Fort Gibson, Takwaho maneuvered his pony alongside Rebecca's. In the weeks she had spent with the Comanche, he had appointed himself her protector and guide, roles he took very seriously despite his youth. "We go home now?" he asked in English. The question gave Rebecca pause. Where was home now? The Comanche. Camp had welcomed her with increasing warmth, but she remained an outsider there, respected for saving the chief's son, but still apart. The charred remains of her cabin offered only memories. And yet, For the first time in years, she felt a sense of possibility, of future rather than past. Yes, she answered finally, home. 3 months later, as winter released its grip on the territory and the first tentative green of spring appeared on the prairie, a new structure stood on Rebecca's land. Not a replica of her old cabin, but something different, larger, sturdier, with elements of both settler and Comanche design. The main house was built of solid logs with a proper stone foundation, featuring glass windows salvaged from Fort Gibson and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Nearby stood a traditional Comanche tipi, used by visiting members of Black Hawk's band who frequently traveled through the area. Between the 2 structures was a fire pit ringed with stones, where cooking and storytelling often took place regardless of weather. Rebecca emerged from the house carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. Her scarred face had taken on a healthy glow from regular time outdoors, and she moved with a confidence that had once seemed lost forever. She set the basket on the rough-hewn table Nathaniel had built, then glanced toward the creek where he was teaching Takwaho how to set fishing lines. The past months had brought changes she could never have imagined when she first found a wounded boy behind her tool shed. After the trial, Chief Black Hawk had declared her a friend of the Numunu, granting her rare permission to establish her home as a neutral meeting place between his people and the settlers. With Nathaniel's help and connections with traders throughout the territory, she had begun creating something unprecedented, a place where cautious understanding could take root between 2 worlds that had known only conflict. Willow Creek's residents remained divided in their reactions. Some, like Abigail Carson, visited regularly, bringing news and supplies from town. Others maintained their distance, uncomfortable with the frequent Comanche presence. But as weeks passed without incident, curiosity began to overcome prejudice. A few farmers had even initiated trade with Black Hawk's band, exchanging grain and tools for expertly tanned hides and medicinal herbs. Takwaho divided his time between his father's camp and Rebecca's homestead. Black Hawk had recognized the value in his son learning the ways and language of the white settlers, preparing him for a future where such knowledge might determine their people's survival. The boy had proven an exceptional student, not only in language but in diplomacy, often serving as interpreter during difficult negotiations. As for Nathaniel, he had surprised everyone, perhaps even himself, by staying. He had built a small cabin near Rebecca's house, respecting propriety while making his intentions increasingly clear. His skills as a tracker and his knowledge of both Comanche and settler ways made him invaluable to the delicate peace they were nurturing. Rebecca watched as he and Takwaho returned from the creek, carrying several fish strung on a line. The boy was chattering excitedly in a mixture of English and Comanche, while Nathaniel listened with the patient attention that had become his hallmark. "Caught 5!" Takwaho announced proudly as they approached. "Big ones!" "I see that," Rebecca smiled. "More than enough for supper." Nathaniel set about cleaning the fish, while Takwaho ran to fetch kindling for the fire. As they worked side by side, Rebecca felt the now familiar warmth of contentment spread through her chest. The scars on her face and in her heart had not disappeared. They never would, but they had transformed from sources of shame into marks of a journey that survived. Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue, the 3 of them sat before the fire. In the distance, dust rose from the prairie as riders approached, members of Black Hawk's band, arriving for the monthly council meeting that would take place the following day. Takwaho spotted them first, jumping to his feet with an excited cry. "Father comes!" he exclaimed, pointing to the distinctive silhouette of the chief among the riders. As the boy ran to meet the approaching party, Nathaniel moved to sit beside Rebecca on the bench he had carved from a fallen oak tree. His shoulder pressed gently against hers, a silent communication that had become increasingly eloquent between them. "Thinking about something?" he asked, noting her contemplative expression. Rebecca watched as Takwaho reached the riders, the joy in his greeting visible even at a distance. "Just remembering," she said quietly, "that first morning when I found him wounded and afraid, how close I came to turning away." "But you didn't," Nathaniel reminded her. "No," she agreed. "And now look at all that's grown from that one moment." The Comanche party drew closer, their horses moving at an easy walk now that they had been welcomed. Black Hawk rode slightly ahead, his ceremonial feathers catching the last golden rays of sunlight. Beside him, Swift Deer and several other women of the band carried bundles of food and gifts for the council gathering. "You've built something rare here," Nathaniel observed, his gaze taking in the approaching riders, the sturdy house, the meeting. Grounds prepared for tomorrow's council. A place between worlds. Rebecca nodded, understanding the truth of his words. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, binding the wounds of a frightened child, had somehow expanded into this. A tenuous bridge across a divide many believed uncrossable. "Not just me," she corrected gently, turning to meet his gaze directly. "We built it, all of us." As darkness settled fully across the prairie and the stars emerged one by one in the vast sky above, Rebecca walked out to meet her guests with Nathaniel. Beside her, the fire behind them cast their shadows long across the ground, not separate silhouettes, but merged into a single, unified shape moving forward into the welcoming night. Takwaho ran back to them, taking Rebecca's hand in his with the easy affection that had become natural between them. "Come," he urged, his English now nearly fluent. "Father brings news from far tribes." Together they moved toward the gathering circle where two worlds would meet again in peace, not because of treaties or politics, but because one woman had chosen compassion over fear, healing over hatred, and in doing so had found her way home. At last, 5 summers passed, each one bringing changes to the frontier that once seemed immutable. The railroad pushed westward, bringing new settlers, new challenges, and new possibilities. Towns that had been mere outposts grew into bustling communities. Willow Creek, once a scattered collection of buildings barely deserving the name town, now boasted a proper schoolhouse, a telegraph office, and streets wide enough for 2 wagons to pass comfortably. But the most remarkable transformation had occurred at what locals now called Crossroads, the unusual settlement that had grown from the ashes of Rebecca Bennett's lonely cabin. What had begun as a simple homestead had evolved into something unprecedented in the territory, a place where Comanche and settler could meet in relative peace, where trade flourished, and where understanding, however fragile, had taken root. The main house had expanded over the years, now featuring a large gathering room where councils and negotiations were regularly held. Nearby stood several traditional teepees, permanent fixtures despite their design for mobility, marking the frequent presence of Black Hawk's band. A stable housed horses from both cultures, and garden plots displayed a blend of native plants and settler crops growing side by side. On a warm June morning, Rebecca stood on the wide porch, watching riders approach from the east. The years had been kind to her. At 38, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her once prominent scars now faded to silvery lines that seemed to blend naturally with the laugh lines forming at the corners of her eyes. Her hair, still worn in a single braid, but now threaded with occasional strands of silver, hung over one shoulder as she shaded her eyes against the rising sun. "They're early," observed Nathaniel, joining her on the porch. The years had weathered him further, adding grey to his beard and deepening the creases at his eyes, but had done nothing to diminish his vigilant presence. The revolver still rode on his hip, though it had been drawn in anger rarely in the past 5 years. Rebecca smiled. Abigail never could stand being late, even for her own birthday celebration. The approaching wagon contained Abigail Carson, now well into her 70s but still fiercely independent, accompanied by her granddaughter Emily and several other families from Willow Creek. Behind them rode Sheriff Davis, a changed man from the one who had once led a posse against them, escorting the new territorial representative, who had expressed interest in learning more about the unusual settlement. As Rebecca moved to welcome them, the sound of hoofbeats from the west announced another arrival. Takwaho, now 17 and nearly a man by Comanche standards, rode toward the homestead with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. He had grown tall and broad-shouldered, his features bearing the strong resemblance to his father that had only become more pronounced with maturity. 5 years of living between two worlds had given Takwaho unique perspective and skills. Fluent in both English and Comanche, understanding the values and customs of both cultures, he had gradually assumed the role of primary interpreter and mediator for increasingly important negotiations. Black Hawk, recognizing his son's special position, had been preparing him to eventually take on leadership responsibilities that might guide their people through the changing times. "Rebecca," Takwaho called out, dismounting with fluid ease. "Father sends word. The chiefs of the southern bands have agreed to attend the council next month." His English was now perfect, with only the faintest accent to betray that it wasn't his first language. This was significant news. The southern Comanche bands had been the most resistant to any form of negotiation with white authorities, having suffered the worst depredations at the hands of unscrupulous traders and military expeditions. "That's the first time they've agreed to come," Rebecca noted, understanding the implications immediately. "Your father must have been very persuasive." Takwaho grinned, a flash of boyish enthusiasm breaking through his increasingly serious demeanor. He reminded them that the woman with the marked face has never spoken with two tongues. He touched her scarred cheek briefly, a gesture of familiar affection. "Your reputation carries weight among the people now." Before Rebecca could respond, the wagon from town pulled into the yard, and she moved to greet her guests. Abigail descended with the help of her granddaughter, waving away offers of further assistance with characteristic stubbornness. 73. "Years old today, not 103, she declared, straightening her spine defiantly. "I can still walk without being propped up like a fence post." The celebration that followed blended traditions from both cultures, a feast featuring dishes from Comanche and settler cuisine, music that alternated between hymns sung by the townspeople and the rhythmic drumming and songs of Black Hawk's band, who arrived mid-afternoon to join the gathering. Children from both groups played together, their laughter a testament to how much had changed in 5 years. As twilight approached, the gathering moved to the large fire circle in the center of the settlement. It was during this transition that Rebecca noticed a newcomer hanging back at the edges of the celebration, a young woman with copper skin and dark eyes that held a familiar wariness. She appeared to be about 15, dressed in a simple cotton dress, but wearing Comanche moccasins and a beaded necklace that marked her heritage. Takwaho noticed Rebecca's gaze and followed it to the girl. His expression changed instantly, a complex mixture of shock and recognition crossing his features. "Small fawn," he whispered, using her Comanche name. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat as she made the connection. The little girl Takwaho had tried to help escape during the attack 5 years ago. The one Wade Brenner had claimed was shot while fleeing. "She survived," Rebecca breathed, remembering Nathaniel's uncertainty about whether the girl had been hit when Curtis Brenner fired at her. Takwaho was already moving toward the girl, speaking rapidly in Comanche. She responded hesitantly, her posture tense with uncertainty. After a brief conversation, he led her to where Rebecca stood watching. "This is Small Fawn," he began, then corrected himself. "She calls herself Sarah now. She has been living with missionaries near Fort Washita since—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Hello, Sarah," Rebecca said gently. "You're welcome here." The girl studied Rebecca's scarred face without the flinching or averted gaze that had once been so common among strangers. Instead, she seemed to find something reassuring in it, as if the mark somehow made Rebecca more approachable rather than less. "Takwaho says, you saved him," she said finally, her English heavily accented, but clear. "He saved himself," Rebecca corrected. "I just helped him heal." Sarah glanced around at the gathering, Comanche warriors sitting alongside settler families, children of both cultures playing together, the territorial representative deep in conversation with Black Hawk through an interpreter. "I didn't know such a place existed," she admitted. "The missionaries said our people and yours could never truly live in peace." "Peace is built one day at a time," Rebecca replied. "Like trust." As night fell completely, Nathaniel joined them, his quiet greeting to Sarah gentle enough not to startle her. He had developed a particular skill for putting traumatized children at ease, drawing on his own experiences of loss and recovery. The evening's culmination came when Black Hawk rose to address the gathered community. Though such speeches had become more common at crossroads over the years, there was something different in the chief's bearing tonight, a solemn purpose that captured everyone's attention. "5 winters ago," he began in Comanche, with Takwaho, translating his words into English, "blood was shed that might have led to war between our peoples. The path of vengeance lay open before us, wide and familiar. The crowd grew hushed, settlers and Comanche alike recognizing the gravity of his words. Instead, another path was shown to us by the woman you call Rebecca." Black Hawk's gaze found her in the crowd. She stood between anger and more blood, offering justice instead of revenge, healing instead of hatred. Rebecca felt the weight of every eye upon her, but no longer shrank from such attention. Nathaniel's hand found hers in the darkness, a quiet anchor of support. "The path she showed us has not been easy," Black Hawk continued. "There are still those among my people who believe peace with the white man is impossible. There are still those among your people who see us only as savages to be conquered or driven away." Murmurs of acknowledgement rippled through both groups, each recognizing the truth in his words. But here, in this place, we have begun to write a different story. The chief gestured to the settlement around them. The blended architecture, the shared fire circle, the children who moved easily between cultures. A story not of enemies, but of neighbors. Not of fear, but of respect. He motioned for Takwaho to join him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder with evident pride. "My son stands with one foot in each world. He speaks with both tongues. He sees with both eyes. And because of this, he will help lead our people toward a future where we do not merely survive the changes coming to our lands, but shape them." The announcement sent a ripple of reaction through the gathered Comanche. For the chief to publicly designate his son as a future leader was significant, especially given Takwaho's unusual upbringing between cultures. Black Hawk then did something unprecedented. He approached Rebecca and Nathaniel directly, standing before them with formal dignity. "The Numunu have a tradition," he said, his deep voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "When someone saves the life of another, they become family, bound by ties stronger than blood. 5 winters ago, you saved my son's life, and in doing so, you became his second mother." Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at this public acknowledgement of what she had felt in her heart for years. "Tonight," Black Hawk continued, "I recognize this bond formally before all present. From this day forward, Rebecca of the marked face is mother to Takwaho, son of Black Hawk, in the eyes of the Numunu. He removed a beaded band from his wrist, an elaborate piece with symbols of the eagle, bear, and sun, worked into the pattern, and fastened it around Rebecca's wrist. "This marks you as family to any Comanche who sees it," he explained, "as one who speaks with a straight tongue and walks a true path between our worlds." The gesture left Rebecca momentarily speechless. She had never sought recognition or honors for what she had done, had simply followed the dictates of compassion when faced with a wounded child. Yet this acknowledgement of belonging, of family, filled a void in her heart that had existed since the night fire had taken her husband and child. "Thank you," she said finally, the words inadequate for the depth of her emotion. "Your son has been as much a blessing to me as I could ever have been to him." Takwaho, standing tall beside his father, smiled at her with the same brightness that had first pierced her isolation 5 years before. Though nearly a man now, in that moment she could still see traces of the brave, wounded boy she had found behind her tool shed. The celebration continued late into the night, taking on new significance. After Black Hawk's announcement, as the hours passed, Rebecca found herself sitting quietly with Nathaniel at the edge of the firelight, watching the blending of cultures with a sense of amazement at how far they had come. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him, gesturing toward the scene before them. Comanche elders teaching settler children a traditional dance, Abigail Carson deep in conversation with Swift Deer about medicinal herbs, Sarah cautiously joining a group of girls her age who welcomed her without hesitation. Nathaniel's eyes reflected the firelight as he considered her question. "Not even in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "When I first rode onto your land that day, I was just hoping to find the boy alive." Rebecca leaned slightly against his shoulder, a comfortable familiarity between them that had deepened over the years. Their relationship had progressed gradually, with respect for each other's past wounds and present strengths. 2 years ago, they had formalized their union in a ceremony that incorporated elements from both cultures. A small silver band now circled her finger, while he wore a beaded bracelet of her making, symbols of commitment that transcended any single tradition. "We've built something remarkable here," she observed quietly. "You started it," he reminded her. "That first choice to help instead of turn away, everything grew from that moment." As the celebration began to wind down, Takwaho approached with Sarah beside him, her initial wariness now softened by hours of cautious integration into the community. "Sarah has nowhere to return to," he explained. "The missionary school closed last month. She was making her way to Fort Gibson when she heard about this place." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, a silent communication born of years sharing the same purpose. "You're welcome to stay here, Sarah," she offered. "For as long as you need." The girl's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "I can work," she said quickly. "I can cook and sew, and there will be plenty of time to figure all that out," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "Tonight, just know you're safe." As they showed Sarah to the small guest cabin that had sheltered many travelers over the years, Rebecca was struck by the symmetry of the moment. Another wounded soul finding refuge at crossroads. Another chance to extend the healing that had begun with one boy's injury and one woman's compassion. Dawn found Rebecca awake early, standing on the porch of the main house as the first golden light spilled across the prairie. The settlement was quiet, most still sleeping after the previous night's celebration. In that peaceful moment, she allowed herself to fully appreciate the journey that had brought her here, from an isolated widow haunted by loss to the heart of this unprecedented community. Her hand moved unconsciously to touch the scars on her face, tracing the lines that had once defined her in the eyes of others. Black Hawk's words echoed in her mind, "Rebecca of the marked face." What had once been a source of shame had become part of her identity, a symbol of survival that commanded respect rather than pity. Behind her, the door opened quietly as Nathaniel joined her, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He passed one to her without speaking, understanding her need for the contemplative silence of early morning. As they stood watching the sun rise over their shared creation, the future stretched before them, uncertain in its details, but rich with possibility. The councils would continue, bringing more bands and more settlers into conversation. Children like Sarah would find healing from wounds both visible and hidden. The delicate balance they had established would face challenges, requiring constant tending like any living thing of value. But in this moment, with the new day painting the world in fresh colors, Rebecca felt a profound sense of rightness. The path that had begun with a wounded boy and a scarred woman had widened into something larger than either could have imagined, a testament to the power of one act of compassion to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. From the guest cabin, Sarah emerged, her face turned toward the sunrise with cautious hope. From the direction of the Comanche encampment, Takwaho appeared, already dressed for the day's responsibilities. And from town, the first wagons of traders began the journey to Crossroads, continuing the exchange that had become vital to both communities. Rebecca took a sip of her coffee, the warm liquid a simple comfort in a world of complex challenges. Nathaniel's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture both protective and acknowledging of her strength. Together they watched as their unlikely family, their improbable community, awakened to another day of building bridges between worlds once thought forever divided. He motioned for Takwaho to join him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder with evident pride. My son stands with one foot in each world. He speaks with both tongues. He sees with both eyes. And because of this, he will help lead our people toward a future where we do not merely survive the changes coming to our lands, but shape them. The announcement sent a ripple of reaction through the gathered Comanche. For the chief to publicly designate his son as a future leader was significant, especially given Takwaho's unusual upbringing between cultures. Black Hawk then did something unprecedented. He approached Rebecca and Nathaniel directly, standing before them with formal dignity. The Numunu have a tradition, he said, his deep voice carrying across the now silent gathering. When someone saves the life of another, they become family, bound by ties stronger than blood. 5 winters ago, you saved my son's life, and in doing so, you became his second mother. Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at this public acknowledgement of what she had felt in her heart for years. Tonight, Black Hawk continued, I recognize this bond formally before all present. From this day forward, Rebecca of the marked face is mother to Takwaho, son of Black Hawk. In the eyes of the Numunu, he removed a beaded band from his wrist, an elaborate piece with symbols of the eagle, bear, and sun, worked into the pattern, and fastened it around Rebecca's wrist. This marks you as family to any Comanche who sees it, he explained, as one who speaks with a straight tongue and walks a true path between our worlds. The gesture left Rebecca momentarily speechless. She had never sought recognition or honors for what she had done, had simply followed the dictates of compassion when faced with a wounded child. Yet this acknowledgement of belonging, of family, filled a void in her heart that had existed since the night fire had taken her husband and child. Thank you, she said finally, the words inadequate for the depth of her emotion. Your son has been as much a blessing to me as I could ever have been to him. Takwaho, standing tall beside his father, smiled at her with the same brightness that had first pierced her isolation 5 years before. Though nearly a man now, in that moment she could still see traces of the brave, wounded boy she had found behind her tool shed. The celebration continued late into the night, taking on new significance. After Black Hawk's announcement, as the hours passed, Rebecca found herself sitting quietly with Nathaniel at the edge of the firelight, watching the blending of cultures with a sense of amazement at how far they had come. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him, gesturing toward the scene before them. Comanche elders teaching settler children a traditional dance, Abigail Carson deep in conversation with Swift Deer about medicinal herbs, Sarah cautiously joining a group of girls her age who welcomed her without hesitation. Nathaniel's eyes reflected the firelight as he considered her question. "Not even in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "When I first rode onto your land that day, I was just hoping to find the boy alive." Rebecca leaned slightly against his shoulder, a comfortable familiarity between them that had deepened over the years. Their relationship had progressed gradually, with respect for each other's past wounds and present strengths. 2 years ago, they had formalized their union in a ceremony that incorporated elements from both cultures. A small silver band now circled her finger, while he wore a beaded bracelet of her making, symbols of commitment that transcended any single tradition. "We've built something remarkable here," she observed quietly. "You started it," he reminded her. "That first choice to help instead of turn away, everything grew from that moment." As the celebration began to wind down, Takwaho approached with Sarah beside him, her initial wariness now softened by hours of cautious integration into the community. "Sarah has nowhere to return to," he explained. "The missionary school closed last month. She was making her way to Fort Gibson when she heard about this place." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, a silent communication born of years sharing the same purpose. "You're welcome to stay here, Sarah," she offered. "For as long as you need." The girl's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "I can work," she said quickly. "I can cook and sew, and there will be plenty of time to figure all that out," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "Tonight, just know you're safe." As they showed Sarah to the small guest cabin that had sheltered many travelers over the years, Rebecca was struck by the symmetry of the moment. Another wounded soul finding refuge at crossroads. Another chance to extend the healing that had begun with one boy's injury and one woman's compassion. Dawn found Rebecca awake early, standing on the porch of the main house as the first golden light spilled across the prairie. The settlement was quiet, most still sleeping after the previous night's celebration. In that peaceful moment, she allowed herself to fully appreciate the journey that had brought her here, from an isolated widow haunted by loss to the heart of this unprecedented community. Her hand moved unconsciously to touch the scars on her face, tracing the lines that had once defined her in the eyes of others. Black Hawk's words echoed in her mind, "Rebecca, of the marked face." What had once been a source of shame had become part of her identity, a symbol of survival that commanded respect rather than pity. Behind her, the door opened quietly as Nathaniel joined her, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He passed one to her without speaking, understanding her need for the contemplative silence of early morning. As they stood watching the sun rise over their shared creation, the future stretched before them, uncertain in its details, but rich with possibility. The councils would continue, bringing more bands and more settlers into conversation. Children like Sarah would find healing from wounds both visible and hidden. The delicate balance they had established would face challenges, requiring constant tending like any living thing of value. But in this moment, with the new day painting the world in fresh colors, Rebecca felt a profound sense of rightness. The path that had begun with a wounded boy and a scarred woman had widened into something larger than either could have imagined. a testament to the power of one act of compassion to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. From the guest cabin, Sarah emerged, her face turned toward the sunrise with cautious hope. From the direction of the Comanche encampment, Taquaho appeared, already dressed for the day's responsibilities. And from town, the first wagons of traders began the journey to Crossroads, continuing the exchange that had become vital to both communities. Rebecca took a sip of her coffee, the warm liquid a simple comfort in a world of complex challenges. Nathaniel's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture both protective and acknowledging of her strength. Together they watched as their unlikely family, their improbable community, awakened to another day of building bridges between worlds once thought forever divided. The morning light caught the beaded band on Rebecca's wrist, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the porch. She smiled, remembering Black Hawk's words. One who speaks with a straight tongue and walks a true path between our worlds. It was a path she would continue to walk, scarred but unbowed, marked not by loss but by love, a woman who had found her purpose in healing wounds more ancient and deep than those that had once marred her face. And in that healing she had found her own, wounds transformed, not erased, but woven into the stronger fabric of who she had become. "Another day begins," Nathaniel observed quietly. Rebecca nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the rising sun promised new possibilities with every dawn. "Yes," she agreed, "and what a beautiful day it is." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.